Good evening. I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, September 20th. We begin tonight with some relief for growing concerns around inflation. Cheaper prices at the pump helped to slow the pace of inflation in August to 7%. Statistics Canada says its latest consumer price report marks the second consecutive month that inflation has slowed on an annual basis. The agency says transportation and shelter prices drove the slowdown in consumer prices, but grocery prices rose at the fastest rate since 1981, with prices up 10.8% compared with a year ago. All right, well, meanwhile, job vacancies in some sectors of the Canadian economy have hit record highs. StatsCan says the country's employers were trying to fill nearly 1 million openings in the second quarter. Now, that's the highest quarterly number on record. The job vacancy rate is at 5.7%, which is also a record high. The sectors with the biggest number of vacancies include the healthcare and social assistance sector, accommodation and food services, and the professional, scientific, and technical services sector. The House of Commons resumed sitting today after its summer break, and it comes on the heels of Thursday's special session honoring the late Queen Elizabeth. The governing Liberals are signaling that their fall priority will be helping Canada's most vulnerable. All political parties are indicating the cost of living crisis is their top priority, and 3 government bills on the immediate agenda deal with new benefits. Well, one of the major moves in the House of Commons today include newly tabled dental care legislation by Health Minister Jean-Yves Duclos. It would allow the government to send checks to low and middle-income families to help them pay for children's oral health services. If granted royal assent, Bill C-31 would provide qualifying families with children under the age of 12 with up to $650 per child each year. This would help pay for dental care services. The benefit is the first phase of the government's larger dental care ambitions. It is also a key element of the Liberal Party's supply and confidence agreement with the NDP. All right, moving to a new study that finds financial pressure is mounting for working Canadians. The study combines the National Payroll Institute's annual survey with analysis by the Financial Wellness Lab of Canada. It says the number of workers living paycheck to paycheck increased by 26% this year compared with last year. Now, part of the analysis categorized Canadians into 3 financial clusters: comfortable, coping, or stressed. And it found that the gap has widened between those who are coping and those who are stressed. On the West Coast, a major lumber producer is blaming market conditions for a temporary production cut in BC. Canfor has announced a 2-week curtailment starting September 26th at the majority of its solid wood facilities in the province. Canfor says it's expected to result in a reduction of about 200 million board feet of production capacity. Production will resume with reduced operating schedules until the end of the year. Employees have been offered the chance to work on maintenance projects and other activities during the downtime. Well, on the other side of the country, the Atlantic Salmon Conservation Foundation Fund is taking applications. It has $1.5 million available to support conservation projects in Atlantic Canada and Quebec. Applications are being accepted until November 15th through the fund. It supports community-led conservation and applied scientific research projects for wild Atlantic salmon. Municipalities, Indigenous groups, community and conservation associations, and others are eligible to apply. A national monument created to share the experiences of residential school survivors is being digitized as part of a new online platform. The witness blanket was created by Kerry Newman. He is a First Nations master carver and artist, and he created it to recognize the atrocities of the residential school era, honor the children and survivors, and symbolize ongoing reconciliation. Mr. Newman, along with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and TELUS, have developed the online platform witnessblanket.ca, and users can hear video testimony from survivors about meaningful objects that are included in the piece. Montreal's Pierre Quenders has taken one of this country's most prestigious music awards. The Congolese-Canadian wins the 2022 Polaris Music Prize for this year's Best Canadian Album based on its artistic merit. Jose Louis and the Paradox of Love was chosen for the $50,000 prize by an 11-member jury at a Toronto gala last night. All right, Forum Daily will be right back after the break. And when we return, we're going to be taking a look at the first fully in-person United Nations General Assembly since the start of the pandemic. We'll be speaking with the Honourable Bob Rae, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. And after that, of course, we'll have more of the major headlines and news stories from around the world. So stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break. On the opening day of the UN General Assembly's top-level meeting in New York, the Secretary General had some tough words for world leaders. The head of the United Nations says countries aren't ready or willing to tackle the major challenges that threaten the future of humanity and the fate of the planet. But the UN chief says there is still hope if nations work as one through cooperation and dialogue. This comes as world leaders hear from international advocates and politicians on the most pressing issues facing the world currently. Well, joining us now to tell us more about Canada's position at the 77th UN General Assembly is the Honourable Bob Rae, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador Rae, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
So a lot of things are expected to be discussed at today's meeting. What are you hoping to come out of this meeting following a year full of international crises, war, and more?
Well, I think I have to give your viewers and listeners a sense of the dynamics of this week. You have 150 leaders of countries. You have 193 countries that are represented. You have many, many civil society organizations, NGOs from around the world, all coming together, all descending on New York at exactly the same time in a very intense 10-day period to have a discussion about a whole range of issues. It's an extraordinary range. There are almost 400 side events on issues around the environment, human rights, conflicts, climate change. You go down the list, it's all there. It's all part of the discussion. I think what the Secretary General was saying today was, look, we are in a very serious moment. We're in a very difficult time with the possibility of a global recession on top of all the other crises that we have been dealing with. And we simply have to make progress. And I think he's right. We do have to make progress. We have to find a way to get enough common ground that will allow us to stop the really serious downward slide in global security, on climate change, inequality issues, the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. All these things go together, and it's really, really important for us to recognize that we have to make progress.
A lot of important conversations to keep our eyes on, Ambassador. Now, Russia's war with Ukraine is going to be a big part of discussions at the gathering. So what is Canada's stance at the General Assembly when it comes to this conflict in particular?
Well, we've been very clear from the outset that this is an unprovoked illegal attack being carried out by the Russians against Ukraine, that it is a war of aggression. Of that, there is absolutely no doubt. And that in carrying out that war, the Russians have been guilty of terrible, terrible atrocities. The knock-on effects, if you like, of this aggression have been really serious, not just for the people of eastern Ukraine, where most of the fighting has been taking place, but for all of Ukraine and then all of Eastern Europe. And then when it comes to food and export of food and the cost of living and the effect on energy security, for example, all of these critical questions, it's had a terrible cascading effect. And that's the one that we're dealing with now. And that's why I think thoughtful people are really very, very concerned about the likelihood of a global recession and what that recession will mean for debt levels, whether people go bankrupt or not, whether countries go bankrupt or not. And we have to understand that these are all possibilities now as a result of what the Russians have been doing.
Some very concerning possibilities, Ambassador Rae. Now, another important topic will be climate change. And Mr. Guterres said something interesting today. He's calling on developing nations to pay for loss and damage happening in poor nations who contribute little to climate change. Now, the question here is that a fair request for Canada in particular?
Well, I think all of the advanced economies are going to have to ask themselves the question. Once the science tells us that the unlimited pollution of the atmosphere with carbon emissions has a serious impact on the weather and on the climate, Can we honestly say that we had nothing to do with the losses and the damages which many countries have been experiencing as a result of what's taken place? So I don't think we can rule out the logic of what's being proposed. I think we can all argue about the numbers, about the affordability of it, and how it's going to be done. But I've been very pleased that my government, the government of Canada, has not taken a position that says never, never, never. We will never discuss this. What we've tried to say is, okay, let's start to get real about what this means, because it's not a one-time payment. It's not like an insurance company paying out for one time. It's about dealing with the impact that these storms, these rising sea levels, the incredible impacts that are being experienced by a great many countries.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is in New York for the 77th General Assembly of the United Nations. Mr. Trudeau arrived in the U.S. late Monday after a long day that included attending the London funeral of Queen Elizabeth. The Prime Minister's UN agenda included talks about climate change, gender equality, and sustainable development. Secretary General Antonio Guterres says this year's gathering will be seized with an urgent sense of crisis. The war in Ukraine is sure to be top of discussion when it comes to the economy and food security. Well, joining us now to discuss the 77th UN General Assembly and Canada's role is Ms. Jamie Webbe, President of the United Nations Association in Canada. Ms. Webbe, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what do we see so far on the opening day of the General Assembly's high-level meeting?
Actually, a really negative tone. So normally when the General Assembly comes together, we're celebrating everything we've achieved over the past year and looking at the accomplishments of the global community. But this year, it's been very down. We've heard a lot of warnings, red flags raised on the environment, on security. And Antonio Guterres has made it very clear, we are in a time of crisis.
A lot to discuss on the docket today and in the coming days. Now, considering this is the first entirely in-person General Assembly meeting since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, what sort of impact had the pandemic had on the working of the United Nations?
Well, certainly it made everything more complicated. The UN can't just pick up and leave because of a pandemic, but it did make delivery of programs more expensive, more complicated. And in terms of the global process in the General Assembly, I think in a way it almost loosened accountability when you're not facing people in the same room, but rather across a computer screen or via email. People tend to be less accommodating and less able to find consensus. And that's certainly what we've heard from a lot of the international meetings that have gone virtual, is that people have said it's just harder to find consensus.
All right. Well, in terms of what's going to be discussed, Russia's war with Ukraine is expected to be a hot topic, especially around its impact on food security. So how is Canada helping to address food security in particular?
Canada is one of the biggest contributors to the World Food Program and continues to maintain that role, and expect we're going to see that continuing. What's a bit challenging, though, is looking at the political context for some of these discussions, especially around food security and the war in Ukraine, and how that is reflected in some of Canada's other political positions in food crisis, including in Ethiopia, with the Tigray conflict going on there, which has largely remained out of the news, but is a significant contributor to food insecurity in the Horn of Africa.
And in terms of the focus of this year's meeting, we know it's going to be for shared cooperation among all the nations. But what are some realistic steps that the international community can take for this to happen?
Well, what we're seeing is a lot of discussion around online misinformation, digital access, digital extremism. So I think we're probably going to see, in terms of concrete actions, some resolutions and some calls for greater coordination in terms of the digital space, of digital aid, online sharing of information. So I expect that that is quite an easy nexus for the world to come together on right now. What's going to be more challenging are issues like the report that came out on China's treatment of the Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities. And that's certainly one of those consensus issues going into this year's General Assembly.
All right, about a little over a minute left here, Ms. Webb, but what else can be expected at the General Assembly in the coming days?
Well, there's a big side event that's happening on education and the future of education. What I'm hoping is that we'll see some progress from Canada on the implementation of Article 14 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which specifically refers to the rights of Indigenous peoples to be educated in their own language and according to their own culture. And I do hope that Canada is going to come up really strong in leading on this issue and leading by example by really supporting the reconciliation process here in Canada through looking at the future of education for our Indigenous communities.
All right, Ms. Jamie Webb, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after the break with a look at the major news stories and headlines from around the world. Authorities in Tigray say Eritrea has launched a military offensive against them. Sweden's central bank raises its interest rate, and Hurricane Fiona hits the Turks and Caicos Islands. We'll have these stories and more after the break, so stay with us. Forum Daily will return in a moment. The separatist leaders of 4 Russian-controlled regions in Ukraine are planning to hold referendums this week. They will be for the territories to become part of Russia. The votes will be held on Friday in Luhansk, Kherson, and the partly Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk regions. It comes as Moscow is losing ground in the invasion it began nearly 7 months ago. All right, turning to tensions in the Horn of Africa, where Tigrayan authorities say Eritrea has launched a full-scale offensive along its border with northern Ethiopia. Now, this appears to be an escalation in fighting that restarted last month. The Eritreans are fighting alongside Ethiopian federal forces. This includes commando units as well as allied militia. Now, that's according to a Tigrayan spokesman, Getachew Reda. He said Eritrea is deploying its entire army as well as reservists. No comment has yet been made by authorities in Ethiopia or Eritrea, which lies north of Tigray. When the war first broke out in November 2020, Eritrean forces were implicated in some of the worst atrocities in the conflict, but they deny the charges. Central banks around the world continue to try to tackle inflation with interest rate hikes, with Sweden's Riksbank being the most recent. It has raised its key interest rate by a full percentage point to combat the highest inflation in more than 30 years. Today's move is the first of a series of large hikes that are expected from central banks worldwide this week. Sweden's central bank says inflation has risen rapidly to 9% in August, which it says is undermining the purchasing power of households. The bank has raised its policy rate to 1.75%. It says it will keep tightening over the next 6 months. This comes as it tries to bring inflation back to its target of 2%. A top UN official has demanded an independent investigation into the death of one Iranian woman. She died after being held by the country's morality police. The woman's death has ignited demonstrations across the country, including the capital of Tehran. Demonstrators chanted against the government and clashed with police. On Tuesday, authorities acknowledged making arrests at the protests. The UN Human Rights Office said Iran's morality police have expanded their patrols in recent months, and they are targeting women for not properly wearing the Islamic headscarf. A similar patrol detained 22-year-old Mahsa Amini last Tuesday. The police say she died of a heart attack. All right, well, meanwhile, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development warns that the world's poorest regions are in dire straits. The Paris-based OECD is reporting that 60 states, territories, and locations fell into the category of fragile contexts last year. This means they were exposed to economic, environmental, social, and political risks that they didn't have the capacity to absorb. It says Russia's war against Ukraine, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the damage of climate change are putting intense pressures on areas, and these areas aren't prepared to handle them. Moving to Hurricane Fiona, which is blasting the Turks and Caicos Islands as a Category 3 storm. This comes after it devastated Puerto Rico, where most people remain without electricity or running water. The government has imposed a curfew and is urging people to flee flood-prone areas. The maximum sustained winds were recorded at 185 kilometers per hour. The Canadian Hurricane Centre says Fiona could hit many areas in the Atlantic. This includes parts of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, PEI, and Ile de la Madeleine in southern Quebec. Actress Angelina Jolie has made a surprise visit to one of the worst flood-hit areas in southern Pakistan to support affected communities. The United Nations humanitarian was in Sindh province. Now, that is where floods since mid-June have killed nearly 700 people, damaged hundreds of thousands of homes, and left 500,000 people homeless. Ms. Jolie's visit comes as Pakistan's Prime Minister is in New York for the UN General Assembly. Shehbaz Sharif is going to highlight the $30 billion worth of damage caused by climate change-induced floods in his country. About 250,000 people joined the line to see Queen Elizabeth II's coffin lying in state in London's Westminster Hall. The UK's Culture Secretary says officials are still crunching the numbers, but they released an estimated count today. Many waited up to 13 hours, braving the cold nights to pay their respects to the late monarch. The Queen died earlier this month in Scotland after 70 years on the throne. She was buried alongside her late husband, Prince Philip, with her parents at Windsor Castle. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and be sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.